At the age of the Civil War, Chicago, one of the fastest growing cities, joined the list of top 10 largest cities by population in the U.S., which was sparked by the Industrial Revolution and immigration. The railroads became one of the driving forces as it expanded from about 30,000 miles of track to nearly 270,000 miles in 1900 across the nation. George Pullman created the luxurious sleeping car, aka his hotel on wheels, and changed the transportation industry. He deliberately decided to hire freed black men as porters to serve passengers every need, literally hand and foot.
Who better to hire than ex-slaves?
Said Larry Tye, the author of Rising from the Rails, where he interviewed 2 Pullman porters.
They were brilliantly attentive. They were incredibly inexpensive to hire.
Blacks were considered to be good servants and provide other forms of entertainment, like choruses, orchestras, or bands. Just like hotels had bellhops. Mr. Pullman took advantage of the master-servant culture that existed in slavery. Initially, his sleeping cars idea was not met with a tremendous amount of success. A few events that followed will impact Pullman's fortune, Chicago, race, and labor rights forever. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, which was one of the leading causes of the Civil War. As the war was coming to an end, President Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. Pullman's sleeping cars gained national notoriety when a Pullman Palace car was used to carry President Lincoln for his funeral procession from Washington, D.C. on April 21st to Springfield, Illinois on May 3rd. In 1867, Mr. Pullman established the Pullman Palace Car Company in Chicago, Illinois. By 1880, he achieved unparalleled success by leasing the luxurious sleeping cars on almost 2/3 of American railroads and providing workers to service the cars. The company-owned town of Pullman was established for its workers to live in. Black workers, however, were not allowed to live in the town. Many years after, the Panic of 1893 attributed to the stock market crash that turned into one of the worst economic depressions in American history. There were several causes for this panic, including the deflation that dated back to the Civil War. The Reading Railroad was the first to declare bankruptcy, while the Pullman Company suffered financially. The Pullman Company secured profits by firing more than 33% of the workforce and lowering wages by more than 25% for the remaining workers. Many workers were not able to feed their families due to the cost of rent and goods remaining unchanged during this time of need. Workers complained to the company's supervisors and independent unions, which led to unjust punishments and terminations. Due to the ineffectiveness of independent unions, the American Railway Union was organized on June 20th, 1893 in Chicago, Illinois. Understanding that with union there is strength, the ARU quickly rose to 100,000 members and represented 35% of Pullman's workforce. They voted to strike on May 11, 1894. The nationwide strike crippled the transportation industry. 30 people were killed due to riots and sabotage, which caused $80 million in damages. There was one caveat to ARU membership. A member must be a railway employee born of white parents. Eugene Debs, the ARU's president, opposed this limitation, but was defeated by the membership. Blacks responded by forming the Anti-Strikers Railroad Union. They were hired as replacement workers in the factory, which went against the objectives of the ARU. Whites systematically kept blacks out of unions to maintain some sense of superiority by writing it into their constitutions. Ultimately, this tactic backfired. Blacks became a major part of the anti-strike movement by being strike breakers. In Illinois, blacks helped to break the Chicago Stockyard Strike, the Quarrymen Drainage Canal Strike, and the White Miners Strike, to name a few. This usually ended with whites being blacklisted and or accepting lower pay. By ignoring history, the ARU was doomed to the same outcome. Eugene Debs thought that excluding blacks from the Union contributed to the failure of the 1894 strike. The ARU made another mistake by derailing a U.S. mail train. The federal government secured an injunction to end the strike. Debs and the ARU leadership ignored the injunction, so President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to end the strike. Ultimately, the strike broke, and 2/3 of the strikers were able to return to their former jobs at reduced rates. These circumstances helped to increase the number of African Americans working for the Pullman Company and on the railways. In the 1900s, white brotherhoods continued to exclude blacks from unions. African Americans began finding value in organizing themselves. The Pullman Company forged a supportive relationship with blacks by protecting them from retaliation by offering food and shelter. They supported black churches, black organizations, and even newspapers. The Pullman Company garnered favor and respect as the middle class grew in the black community. By the end of World War I, Pullman had become one of the largest employers of African Americans and helped to create the black middle class. It offered a prestigious position and cross-country travel without heavy manual labor. However, porters continued to be overworked, mistreated, and underpaid, so they had to rely on tips. They were trapped by stereotypes of servitude linked to the past of slavery. In 1925, a group of unhappy Pullman porters decided to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Under the charismatic leadership of Asa Philip Randolph, they became affiliated with the American Federation of Labor and went from being a mild representation of the porters and maids to holding the roster of over half the Pullman African American staff within 3 years. In 1935, the AFL gained momentum with the passing of the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed the rights of private company employees to organize into unions, conduct collective bargaining, and engage in collective action. Based on this legislation, the BSCP was able to force the Pullman Company to the bargaining table without the threat of losing jobs, being harassed, and being recognized as an official union of the Pullman Porters. Newly unionized railroad workers enjoyed better pay, and the railroad work grew increasingly safe. Finally, railroad workers of all race, color, and creed were getting the respect that they longed for. The heart of an activist never dies. When the BSCP achieved some level of equality in the labor movement, many members worked for the advancement of African Americans socially, economically, and politically. It was the beginning of a new era called the Civil Rights Movement. Here are a few examples. In 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which banned discrimination by federal agencies and all unions engaged in war-related work against any person's race, color, creed, or national origin. This march was canceled. On March 2, 1955, Claudette Colvin was the first person arrested for resisting bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. Edward Daniel Nixon, a Pullman porter, organized a boycott around this concept that led Rosa Parks to have a seat on December 1, 1955. The boycott crippled whites financially. In 1963, A. Philip Randolph was the lead organizer of the March on Washington to fight for jobs and freedom. It became the platform for a small-town preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who considered Randolph to be truly the dean of Negro leaders. This march had a global impact and changed many laws over time. Being a Pullman porter offered blacks a prestigious job and an escape from the agricultural jobs with former slave owners. This allowed the exploration of new opportunities, a better standard of life, and human rights that were blocked due to racism. Being overworked and mistreated created a stir of discontent in their hearts that spearheaded the long fight for labor rights. They had to encounter the Pullman Company, labor unions, current laws, and public opinion during their fight. In exchange for this fight, they were able to win labor rights for African Americans as well as for everyone else. This launched an attitude of protest and action, which led many porters to fund and lead the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement and a speech that would change the world in 1963. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech would not have been heard without him standing on the shoulders of a few Pullman porters who dreamt of real working freedom and everyday respect.